Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Welcome to the third season of the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School Initiative. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, we have part 2 of my conversation with Rob Winstead and Maria Bninski from VMDO, a 45-year-old architecture firm headquartered in Charlottesville, Virginia. Rob is principal and K-12 studio leader for VMDO, and Maria an associate architect. VMDO has built a long track record of leading-edge design in learning spaces, K-12 schools, higher education institutions, and community recreational buildings. The firm stands out in its use of research science to create learning spaces that are attuned to the learning and development of students. Physical space can be an especially powerful influencer of educational engagement and performance, as well as positive development for young adolescents in the middle grades.
Air quality, access to daylight and views, appropriate acoustic environments that aren't, you're not hearing HVAC noise, you're not hearing buzzing lights, there's enough absorptive material in the classroom, really impact people's ability to learn and to function cognitively. And these are things that are talked about a lot in the design of, Class A office space. Employers, are eating this up, return on investment, fewer sick days. But these are not things that many school districts have learned to demand of their buildings. And who is in there, in middle school, like we've discussed today, people who are at some of their most sensitive development, and, shouldn't that be the top priority for who gets this kind of healthy environment?
Here in part 2 of our conversation, Rob, Maria, and I talk about how VMDO works in partnership with educators, students, and communities to design learning spaces, what financial resources are required for these projects, and how to think about managing those costs over time, and how VMDO engages in research collaborations to contribute to the overall knowledge base in this area overlapping architecture and education. Previously, in part 1 of our conversation, we talked about the beginnings of VMDO, the firm's approach to designing physical space to support the learning and development, as well as the health and wellness of youth and young adolescents in particular, using developmental science and extensive stakeholder engagement as foundational guides. Part 1 is now available wherever you get your podcasts. And now, here is part 2 of my conversation with Rob Winstead and Maria Bninski. Well, you have a long list of K-12 clients, largely, as you mentioned, in the Mid-Atlantic region, but elsewhere as well. I'm curious to know how the work we've been talking about here, which again, I think is really highly aligned to adolescent development, particularly, I love the notions of just the variety and variability, the getting away from schools that had that kind of rigidity and that sameness, which runs counter, I think, to the notion of exploration and self-discovery. And so I could see how it's that kind of thing is very appealing to educators. Just talk to me about how that process works. Like if I'm bought in, if I'm a superintendent or a principal of a school, or even an educator, a teacher, a counselor, a social worker, what does working with a VMDO look like?
I would say, unfortunately, typically there's not enough engagement with communities, with staff and educators, and in particular with students. That's actually pretty rare. The people that are most often making these decisions are board of supervisors and city councilors who are elected officials who fund these projects. But I will say, on the other hand, VMDO tries as hard as we can to make the design and construction process as inclusive and as broad as possible. And so, we often start the process by really, in those first conversations, what are the needs of your community? What level of engagement do you actually want? But I personally think the programming phase is when a lot of the magic happens. The planning and programming phase is when a lot of the innovation and potential of the project is unlocked. And you can have these broad conversations about how does the environment interact with the other elements of the learning experience? How are you using time? What is the curriculum? What are you teaching and how are you teaching it? How are you staffing your buildings? How are you leveraging technology? Are you a one-to-one school? Et cetera. We influence the environment, but the decisions we make in the environment is influenced and affects all of those other factors. Ideally, the best environments are the ones where those things are aligned and working as a kind of ecosystem.
We all have a sort of a job to do in this world, and teachers, know what they have to do and have to accomplish. So I imagine someone with your expertise coming in can kind of enlighten them to showcase what physical space can do to improve their sort of own practice.
Absolutely. I think sharing high quality precedent projects and really ideally visiting them actually can be really transformative in terms of trying to imagine what's possible because, right, we're all working out of our set of a kind of reference. What do we know? What have we seen? And breaking out of that or, widening that can be extremely powerful, especially when I think educators and leaders in education get to talk to people at other institutions, other schools, where it's like, oh, wow, you really are making this work in a very different way. It's a significant investment, so you don't want to roll the dice and, try something kind of wild and then it doesn't work out. So there's a lot of responsibility, but there's also the potential to really miss an opportunity if you just repeat what you've been doing in the past. And I really believe that for educational leaders who are going to take part in a process like this, you don't need to learn to be an architect. You don't need to learn all about architecture. You are bringing an incredible asset if you have a clear educational vision and you share that with the architect and you insist on the best for your young people.
Maria, you mentioned, this is an investment. It takes a lot of resources to do, specifically to do it well. And again, if I'm a school or district leader or a school board member, as you mentioned, Rob makes a lot of these decisions. I'm probably familiar with the ways the capital projects are paid for, whether it's levying taxes or borrowing or sometimes government grants. But what's your approach with your K-12 clients on the financial resources side of your engagements?
These are big numbers, and typically, school budgets are very often the largest portion of a municipal budget. So we recognize how significant these investments are for communities, and we take very seriously our role as stewards of those dollars. But I do want to blow up the myth that our buildings cost more because it's just not true. The real investment here from a community is time and focus and commitment to doing the best for future generations in their community. The schools that we design don't cost any more than typical schools that are built. It's really about creative problem solving and really making sure that we're focusing those dollars on the places where they're really going to matter. So I'll give you an example. We're well known for the design of net zero energy buildings that produce as much energy on an annual basis as they use. And everybody's like, how can you possibly afford that? Doesn't that cost just $1 bazillion? Well, they don't cost more than the other schools that they're designing. However, they do minimize the operational costs of those buildings for their entire life. And so we've got buildings that are returning or cost avoidance basically by not paying utility bills over $100,000 a year for a single school. So it's really a matter of focus and saying, these are the goals that we have. And like Maria said, really holding the community, the design team, everybody involved, accountable to those goals.
Yeah, and they're cumulative, right? You talked before about young people when their favorite experience were these spaces in early schooling where they're sort of open and more sort of experiential. And if they're put in these sort of rigid domains that runs counter to their developmental state, these are consequential. They sort of remember these and they have a sort of an effect on people as they grow and develop. Maria, you talked before about, you referenced a number of research studies and sort of the academic piece of this. One of the things I've really loved and appreciate about the work that you do is how you're contributing to the knowledge base through research collaborations. It sounds as if you were really intent, just as a firm, on helping influencers and decision makers better understand through research and data how design can be a lever for effective education and positive youth development. Tell us about that side of your work. I don't know enough about architecture firms to know whether that is unique or not, but it certainly adds an important dimension.
I would say it's not something that's at all built into the typical architectural process or practice. I think we work hard and are really, trying to go the extra mile to make it happen. But this is a huge potential growth area, I think, for our industry as a whole. We work with the Center for the Built Environment to do what we call post-occupancy evaluations. So the Center for the Built Environment is a national organization that is trying to, be one of those resources that allows architecture firms to gather information after their building is complete and is occupied, how it's doing, how it's affecting the occupants. Is it really supporting the life that it was designed to support? They have, modules of questions that are deployed nationwide by any architecture firm that partners with them. But then we also have designed our own module of questions that's specific to, issues of teaching and learning that we're interested in, because their surveys are used on, all types of buildings.
I am incredibly proud of that work. Every major project that VMDO designs goes through a post-occupancy evaluation. And then we take the results from that and we actually, create a feedback loop back into our design process, right? What are the responses that we're getting? What can we learn from that? How do we change our design and our thinking? And we actually go back to our clients and say, like, hey, here's what we learned. We actually learned you've got a cleanliness and maintenance problem in your building, or you've got a thermal comfort problem in your building, right? We can help you with that, and it'll improve outcomes in your building. And then currently, right now, we are trying to create a stronger relationship with the School of Education at UVA and with Youth-Nex in particular, to focus on middle schools. And we're designing the Buford Middle School project in Charlottesville, and we're trying to work with researchers, not only to influence that design as it's underway, but also to do pre and post occupancy studies of the current building and then of the future building, to learn, have the improvements that we've made in that facility really significantly influenced outcomes in that environment.
Important work that we do related to research is educating our clients about building science research that has happened, in the past 10, 20 years. And the real, we've touched on this before, but the incredible impact that air quality, access to daylight and views, appropriate acoustic environments that aren't, you're not hearing HVAC noise, you're not hearing buzzing lights, there's enough absorptive material in the classroom, really impact people's ability to learn and to function cognitively. And these are things that are talked about a lot in the design of, Class A office space. Employers, are eating this up, return on investment, fewer sick days. But these are not things that many school districts have learned to demand of their buildings. And who is in there, in middle school, like we've discussed today, people who are at some of their most sensitive development. And, shouldn't that be the top priority for who gets this kind of healthy environment? And it also supports things we've talked about in terms of community and connectedness, because teachers do care about these things. And we saw a study in DC and Chicago, I think, that showed that facility quality was affecting the attraction, support, and retention of educators. And so, having a community where people want to stick around and they feel good showing up each day, the building really does impact that.
Finally, Rob and Maria, what's one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from this conversation based on your work designing spaces that are attuned to the developmental needs of students, things you'd like educators, both in school and in after school and summer programs, to know or be able to do?
The spaces where you learn really do matter. And I know that we all know this intuitively in our own lives, as we set up our workspace or work with our own children for example. We all know this intuitively, but it seems like when we get into these big complex projects where there's a lot of stress and tension around the magnitude of the investment, and there's a lot of people involved, a lot of voices involved, we tend to lose sight of that. And I think educational leaders, a huge part of what they can bring to the process is to maintain that focus on students and on learners, on their staff, on the quality of the environment, and that the space really does matter. The other thing I'd say is that engagement really does matter, that making the process as broad and as inclusive as possible. It doesn't have to take years and years and millions of dollars. I think it can be a very focused and intentional, thoughtful process, but don't skip that process, because I think that giving people the opportunity to weigh in before you're asking them to buy in, especially if you're doing something new. If you ask most educators, if you could have any education environment you want, they'd say pretty much what I've got, but more storage and outlets, right? And so there's a process where they have to visit these other environments and talk to other educators and imagine what could be, 30 years in the future within the lifetime of the investment that you're making. So don't skip that process. I think that engagement really matters, and making it as inclusive as possible. And then, of course, I think we need to do something about the environments that we've got. I think we keep reinforcing, 50-year-old ideas about education, kind of factory model of education, because a lot of the people that are making decisions about that, that's their experience, that's their understanding or image of school. But the world has moved on, and just the hybrid learning, distance learning that we've experienced during our COVID response just shows how dramatically learning has changed, right? And really working as community, as a society, to figure that out and to continue to do what's best for future generations, I think is critical. And it doesn't have to cost more. Creativity doesn't cost more. I think it could be the same investment leveraged in a different way.
I think a lot of it is reiterating, what Rob has said about that this is really worth doing. The science is there about cognitive function and outcomes. It can grow, but we know that it's important enough that people should be bold in advocating for their students and their children and their communities to have facilities that, aren't holding back the people inside of them. We've talked a bit about money. There's a huge annual investment by communities everywhere in our country for the operational expenses of schools. And communities are investing in bringing people together for a purpose, every day. And it doesn't make sense to bring them together into a space that then holds them back.
Rob, Maria, this has been fun. We've covered some new ground here on the podcast. We try to look at many different aspects of learning and development for young adolescents. So your expertise and your experience in the physical environments that we place our young people in is a compelling angle for us to explore, and I hope we can do it more. So thanks so much for all your work in the education space and for coming on to share it with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
That was Rob Winstead and Maria Bninski from VMDO. You can learn more about VMDO online at vmdo.com or on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at VMDO Architects. Remember, you can look out for part 1 of my conversation with Rob and Maria, which is out now, on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I interviewed Ron Berger, longtime educator and program developer, and now senior advisor teaching and learning for EL Education. Beginning more than 30 years ago, EL Education was born out of the Outward Bound model of experiential learning that centers around young people and adults building strong bonds with each other and exploring and influencing the world together rather than alone. An approach to education that has particular resonance for young adolescents.
In Outward Bound, there's a phrase that came from the founder of Outward Bound, Kurt Hahn, which is, "We are crew, not passengers." like we're in this together, strengthened by acts of consequential service to others. And so it's about being a team. It's about that team approach. So the structure we use for the middle grades is students meet with their crew, which is a small group. It's not a full homeroom of 26 kids. It's a group of 10 to 15 kids that meet every day in a small group and talk about their social and emotional health, talk about their families, talk about their lives, talk about how they're doing. They also talk honestly about how they're doing academically. Am I failing mathematics? Am I failing science? Like, what's going on? And they hold each other accountable. It's a place where you can actually be honest about how you're doing personally, but also how you're doing academically. We don't separate those two.
You can listen to both parts of my conversation with Ron wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Paige Waterhouse. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website, on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.